The briefing lasted 11 minutes. Colonel Brett Harmon stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed and his voice low, the particular kind of low that meant the information being passed was either classified beyond the usual threshold or the situation was worse than the paperwork suggested. In this case, it was both. The target's name is Khalid Nassar, he said. He has been on the agency watch list for 22 months. 3 prior interdiction attempts. 3 failures. He let that land. This is not a combat mission in the traditional sense. We are not clearing a compound. We are not extracting personnel. We are removing one individual from a very specific location during a very specific window. Chief Petty Officer Garrett Voss sat in the 3rd row and studied the satellite image projected on the wall. The terrain was open. Flat rock transitioning to sand, a cluster of low structures at the center of the frame, no more than 6 or 7 buildings, the kind that went up in a week and could be abandoned in an hour. The surrounding area offered almost nothing in the way of cover except the terrain itself, shallow ridgelines, heat shimmer, the occasional depression in the earth that might conceal a prone man if he held completely still. Garrett had operated in worse. He'd also operated in better. The problem, as the colonel went on to explain, was not the terrain and it was not the target's security detail, which was, by intelligence estimates, no larger than 8 to 12 men. The problem was confirmation. 3 prior attempts failed because we could not confirm visual on the target with enough certainty to authorize a shot, Harmon said. The signature analysis matched on 2 occasions, the geolocation data matched on all 3, but without confirmed visual. He paused. The authorization does not come through. So we're doing this one differently? Asked Petty Officer First Class Dean Calloway from the back of the room. Dean had the build of a man who took his job personally, broad shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been shaped with industrial tools, and a habit of asking the questions nobody else wanted to voice. We are doing this one with a narrower window and a tighter ROE, the colonel said. The window is 4 hours. The team goes in, establishes overwatch, and waits for the target to present. Confirmation threshold has been reviewed. It is still high. He looked at the room. That's the job. Garrett studied the image a moment longer before the lights came back up. He noticed, as he always did, the things the briefer didn't mention. The heat distortion at the edges of the frame, the way the structures sat at an angle that would push thermal signature readings into the surrounding rock. The lack of shadow data that would have told him something about the time of day the satellite passed. He didn't say anything about it. He filed it away. The team deployed 12 hours later. There were 9 of them on the ground, 7 operators, 1 signals specialist named Marcus Webb, who was technically attached from a different unit and therefore spent the first 2 hours of the insertion trying to convince everyone that his equipment was not redundant, and a forward air controller named Pete Dunbar, who had done 4 rotations before this one and carried himself with the specific exhaustion of a man who had seen the thing everyone was worried about happening actually happen. The landscape received them without comment. Desert had a way of doing that, absorbing human presence, the way it absorbed heat, indifferently, without acknowledgement. Garrett established the overwatch position along the western ridgeline. The elevation was modest, perhaps 40 feet above the desert floor, but it was enough. He and his primary sniper, Specialist Ryan Colby, set up in a shallow declivity behind a formation of dark rock that retained heat through the night and released it slowly through the morning hours. By the time the sun was overhead, the rock around them radiated like a furnace. Ryan was 28. He had qualified as a sniper at 23, and had since accumulated a record that his peers discussed with the particular reverence reserved for things they didn't entirely understand. He was technically sound, physically disciplined, and almost entirely silent in the field, which Garrett considered his most important quality. Winds reading 4 knots from the southwest, Ryan said. He was looking through his scope, but the thermals are doing something. What kind of something? The kind I can't calculate. He adjusted fractionally. The heat coming off the flat between us and the structures is layered. There's a cold inversion at about. He stopped. It's interfering with my read. Garrett understood the problem before it was fully articulated. Desert shooting in high heat was never simple. The relationship between around in flight and the air it traveled through became complicated when the air itself was unstable, when layers of different temperature created refraction effects that bent light and therefore bent what the optics showed you. What you saw was not always where the thing was. A man could appear to be standing in one location when the distortion of the air between the shooter and the target placed him 6, 10, 15 feet from where the scope said he was. It was not a new problem. It was also not a solvable one with the equipment they had. "How's Marcus's signal?" Garrett asked. Heat Dunbar answered from 6 feet to his left. "Drone feed is degraded. He's getting interference from something ground-based. He thinks it's passive equipment in the structures. Not active jamming, but he can't confirm. So we're running on glass and instinct." "We're running on glass and instinct." Garrett settled in. The sun continued its arc. The structures sat quiet in the flat below. Occasionally, a figure moved between buildings, but the figures moved in ways that suggested routine rather than awareness of the team's presence, slow, unhurried, following patterns that looked like the patterns of men who had been in the same place for several weeks and had stopped paying attention to their perimeter. 2 hours passed, then 3. Ryan made 3 separate assessments and pulled back from each one. Each time, he reported the same issue. The heat signature at the identified location was consistent with the target profile, but the visual would not resolve cleanly enough to confirm the face. The distortion was too severe. At the ranges they were working just over 1,400 meters, the interference added up. "I need either a shorter distance or a cleaner air column," Ryan said. His voice was flat. He was not frustrated in any visible way. He was simply reporting data. "We can't move closer," Garrett said. "I know." The team held. At the 4-hour mark, the internal communication that Garrett had been quietly managing since the insertion broke open into something harder to contain. Dean Calloway moved up to the overwatch position without being invited and crouched behind the rock formation with his arms resting on his knees. He looked through his own optic for a while. Then he looked at Ryan, then he looked at Garrett. "We've got maybe 90 minutes before that window closes," he said. "I'm aware of the clock," Garrett said. "Ryan, you've had 3 clear windows on a thermal consistent with the target profile. At what point does consistent become confirmation?" Ryan didn't look away from his scope. "When I can see a face. In this heat at this distance. When I can see a face," Ryan said again. Same voice. No variation. Dean pressed his lips together and looked at Garrett. "We came a long way for a dry hole." "We came a long way to do the job correctly," Garrett said. "Which means not taking a shot we can't confirm. That's not caution. That's the requirement." "I understand the requirement." "Then let Ryan work." Dean stayed crouched behind the rock for another minute and then moved back to his position. Garrett watched him go without expression. He was not angry at Dean. Dean was doing what men in high-pressure situations did. He was looking for a way through that felt like action. The problem with Dean's way through was that it collapsed the space between a decision and a mistake. Marcus Webb appeared at Garrett's shoulder. He was a narrow, dark-haired man who moved with the tentative quality of someone who knew his presence was tolerated rather than wanted. "The drone's coming back online," he said. "Maybe 60% of full resolution. Can Ryan use it? I can send the feed to his scope overlay." "Do it." The feed came through. Ryan spent 4 minutes with it and then reported that it confirmed the heat signature pattern but did not improve the visual resolution problem. The distortion was in the air between them and the target. No camera system positioned at their location could see around it. "It's not an equipment problem," Ryan said. "It's a physics problem." No one answered that. 60 minutes left in the window. Garrett got on the radio to Colonel Harmon and reported the situation in 3 sentences. The colonel's response was a silence that lasted long enough to mean he was weighing options that none of them would enjoy, followed by a single instruction. "Hold position. Additional asset is inbound. 20 minutes. Garrett relayed this to the team. The reaction was mostly silence, the particular kind of silence that meant people had questions they had decided not to ask. "What asset?" Dean said. The colonel didn't specify. "In 20 minutes. In 20 minutes. Dean said nothing else. Ryan went back to his scope. The heat continued to build. The vehicle was a Land Cruiser, mid-2000s, the kind of thing the region produced in abundance. Tan, beat up, unremarkable in every dimension. It came from the south along a track that technically didn't exist on any of the maps they were working with, which was itself a kind of information. It stopped at the base of the ridgeline. One person got out. She was tall, but not unusually so. She wore civilian clothes, a lightweight long-sleeved shirt the color of sand, loose pants, boots that had seen considerable mileage, no visible insignia, no visible weapon, though the way she moved made that absence feel like a choice rather than an oversight. She had dark hair pulled back simply. She looked, Garrett thought, like someone who had been doing something difficult for a very long time and had arrived at a relationship with difficulty that was no longer combative. She climbed the ridgeline without being told where to go. Dean watched her come up and said, to no one in particular, "This is the asset." It was not phrased as a question. She reached the overwatch position and stopped. She looked at the flat below for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at the team. She did not introduce herself. "Who's your shooter?" she said. Garrett nodded toward Ryan. "Colby." She moved to Ryan's position and crouched beside him. She looked at his setup, the rifle, the tripod, the scope with an expression that gave nothing away. Then she looked through her own optic, a handheld spotting scope that she produced from a bag at her hip. It was old. The housing had the kind of wear that came from use in conditions the manufacturer had probably not imagined. She looked through it for a long time. Ryan watched her with the careful neutrality of a man who had been trained not to respond to provocation and was applying that training in a direction it wasn't designed for. "What's she doing?" Dean said quietly to Garrett. "Looking," Garrett said. "At what?" "I don't know yet." She lowered the optic. She turned to Ryan. "How many shots have you assessed?" "3, Ryan said. "Each time, what was the failure point?" "Visual confirmation." The target profile was consistent with all 3, but the facial resolution at 1400 meters in this heat column is... "It's not a heat column," she said. She said it the way you correct a small factual error without emphasis, without superiority. Just the adjustment. It's a convergence. There are 2 thermal layers meeting at approximately 600 meters out. The lower layer is coming off the rock shelf she gestured, and the upper layer is coming off the face of those structures. Where they meet, the air density differential is significant enough to refract visible light. You're not seeing the target through a heat shimmer. You're seeing a composite image that's been shifted. She paused. "Shifted by how much?" Ryan asked. "Between 8 and 12 feet to the east, depending on the layer thickness at any given moment." She looked at him. "You've been aiming at where the image is. You need to aim at where the body is." The silence that followed had a particular quality. It was the silence of a room where something has been said that cannot be unsaid and that changes the shape of everything that came before it. Garrett studied the terrain below. He looked at the position Ryan had been tracking. He tried to understand, geometrically, what she had described: the physics of 2 air masses meeting at different temperatures and densities, bending light the way a lens bends it, creating an image that was real but displaced. He could follow the logic of it. He wasn't certain he would have seen it. "You've operated in this specific terrain?" he asked her. She looked at him. "Not this one," she said. "Similar." "The physics doesn't change." She asked for the drone feed to be shut down. Marcus Webb looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at her. "Why?" Garrett said. "Because it's creating signal interference with the passive systems in those structures," she said. "Which means they know something is operating in this sector. They may not know what. They may not know where. But they know." She looked at Marcus. "How long has the drone been active?" "Approximately 3 hours, Marcus said. "Then they've been adjusting for 3 hours. She turned back to the flat. "Shut it down. Give them 10 minutes of silence. They'll relax." "And if they use that 10 minutes to move the target?" Dean said. She looked at him. "He's not going to move in the next 10 minutes. You can't know that. He's been in the same building for 6 hours, she said. "He's comfortable. People who are comfortable don't move without reason. Take away their reason." She looked at Garrett. "Shut down the drone." Garrett held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Do it." The drone feed went dark. She turned back to her spotting scope and went still. The team waited. The sun pushed down on the rock and the rock pushed back. Ryan stayed behind his scope but did not assess he was waiting. Garrett understood. To be given something new to work with. 8 minutes passed, she said, quietly. "There." Ryan's eye went to his scope. "I don't have..." "West corner of the second building," she said. "Not the doorway. The shadow beside the doorway. Someone moved that shadow 60 seconds ago, and it hasn't come back." Ryan adjusted. Garrett looked through his own glass. He saw the doorway. He saw the shadow beside the doorway. A dark pool along the base of the wall. "I still don't have a profile," Ryan said. "You're not going to," she said. "Not from here. Not the way you're looking." She paused. "I need a rifle," she said. The statement landed without drama. Ryan didn't move. Dean shifted his weight. Marcus Webb suddenly found something important to look at on his equipment. Garrett studied the woman beside him, the way she was crouched behind the spotting scope with the patient stillness of something built to wait, and made a decision that he would later describe, in the debrief, as the only logical choice available given the information in front of him. "Ryan," he said. Ryan looked up. "Let her work." Ryan moved aside. She unzipped the bag at her hip. The rifle she produced was not what any of them expected. It was old, not antique, not inoperative. but old in the way that specialized instruments become old when they are maintained rather than replaced. The stock had been refinished at some point. The action was smooth in a way that spoke of considerable use and considerable care. The optic mounted on it was a fixed power scope, no electronic adjustment, the kind of thing that had been manufactured before digital ballistic assistance existed. She laid down behind it, in a single motion. The position she took was unusual. Her body angle to the rifle was slightly off from what the team's doctrine would have prescribed. Her breathing was already slow, not the controlled slowness of technique but something deeper, something that suggested she had stopped thinking about her breathing entirely and it had found its own level. "What's the target indicator?" Ryan asked. He had moved to her right. He was watching, not objecting. "I'll tell you when I have it," she said. She was looking through the scope. Her voice was the same it had been since she arrived, even without urgency, without the slight edge of performance that voices sometimes carry when the speaker knows they are being watched. She moved the rifle a fraction more. She stopped, 8 feet east of where you were tracking, she said to Ryan. "Do you see the thermal differential at the base of the wall?" Ryan was looking through his spotting scope. A long pause. "I see a yes. There's a density change. That's where he is. You can see him in that?" "No," she said. "I can see where he isn't. The distortion pattern has a gap. The gap is shaped like a man standing against a wall." No one spoke. "The gap has been consistent for 4 minutes, she said. "He's not moving." The minute before the shot was, in Garrett's later account, the most complete silence he had experienced in the field. It was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of something that had been gathering for a very long time arriving at its moment. She was still, not the trained stillness of an operator suppressing the urge to move, the genuine stillness of a person for whom stillness was a natural state. Her hands were relaxed on the rifle. The index finger of her right hand was along the trigger guard, not touching the trigger, not hovering above it, simply resting at the point that was one intentional movement from action. Ryan was watching her through the spotting scope, Garrett thought, in the way that skilled practitioners watch each other, not to judge, not to compete, but to learn. Whatever disagreement Ryan might have had with the situation had been replaced by something else. He was watching the way a student watches a demonstration. Garrett looked at Dean. Dean was watching the flat below. His expression had changed. The urgency that had been driving him earlier in the day, the clock-driven anxiety that produced bad suggestions, was gone. He was simply watching. The wind changed, not dramatically. A small shift, perhaps 2 knots, coming now from slightly further north, carrying a faint additional heat from the rock field to the northwest. She made a single adjustment, not to the scope, to her body. A fractional rotation of her left shoulder that changed the geometry of her hold by a degree or 2, Ryan said, very quietly. "She just compensated for the wind shift before I read it on the gauge." Garrett said nothing. She was looking through the scope with the quality of attention that made looking seem like the wrong word. She was doing something more precise than looking. 45 seconds, the shadow at the base of the building wall moved. The gap in the distortion pattern shifted. She was already there. There was a sound. Later, in the debrief, when each team member was asked to describe the discharge independently, the accounts varied in ways that were not inconsistent with each other but were inconsistent with what they expected to report. Dean said it sounded muted, not suppressed, but absorbed, as though the hot air around them had taken the report and distributed it before it could form a clear impression. Marcus said he wasn't sure he heard it at all, that his awareness of the shot came from the movement of her body cycling the action. Ryan said he heard it but would not have known it was a shot without context. Pete Dunbar said simply that it was the smallest sound he had ever heard a rifle make. The round traveled 1,430 meters. At that distance, the time of flight was approximately 2 seconds. They waited. The shadow at the base of the wall did not shift. It collapsed. The distinction was important. A shift was a person moving. A collapse was something else. Ryan's spotting scope confirmed it in 4 seconds. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful quality of a man reporting something he wants to get exactly right. "Confirmed," he said. "Target is down. Facial confirmation from collapse position. It's him." Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The kind of response that came not from discipline but from the experience of something that exceeded what enthusiasm could address. Garrett looked at the woman. She had risen to a seated position. She was looking at the flat below, not checking her work in any anxious sense, simply looking. "The way you look at something you are finished with," he said. That's a 1,400-meter shot with non-standardized equipment in a distorted air column, she said. Yes, he waited to see if she would add anything. She didn't. The distortion compensation, he said. How did you know the exact offset? I've been looking at this terrain for 25 minutes, she said. The physics is consistent. Once you know the layer thickness and the temperature differential, the refraction index is calculable. It's not simple, but it's not guesswork. You calculated that in your head. I've done it before. He believed her. The problem was that the calculation she was describing, performed in the conditions they were operating in, without instrumentation, in the time available, was the kind of thing that appeared in technical papers on long-range ballistics as a theoretical capability. He had met perhaps 3 people in his career who could have done it with instruments. He had not met anyone who could have done it without them. Who are you? He said. She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him directly with something that might have been an expression rather than a neutral baseline. My job right now is to get your team out of this position, she said. Before the security detail in those buildings finishes processing that their principal is dead, they had 40 minutes. She ran the extraction differently than the insertion brief had anticipated. The planned route took them back north along the ridge line and to the primary exfil point, a journey of approximately 90 minutes at mission pace. She changed the route. The northern route is exposed for 300 meters before you reach the secondary ridge, she told Garrett as they moved. In 40 minutes, there will be personnel from those buildings looking for a firing position. The northern route puts you in their optimal search area. The southern route adds 30 minutes to the exfil. The southern route keeps the rock formation between you and them for the entire movement, she said. You're late to the helicopter or you're early to a firefight. Choose. He chose the southern route. She moved with the team in the middle of the file, not at the front, not at the back. She carried her rifle in a standard patrol carry that looked practiced. She did not struggle with the terrain. She did not speak unless she was saying something that mattered. At the 12-minute mark, she told Garrett to stop the team. He stopped them. She listened. A minute passed. Then she said, "They're moving north. They took the same route assessment I did, but they're betting you'd run the fast route. Can you hear them?" "I can hear ATVs," she said. "Listen." He listened. In the distance, muted, processed by the heat and the rock, there was an engine sound. Then two, moving northeast. "If we'd taken the northern route," Garrett said, "you'd be walking into them in approximately 8 minutes, she said. He filed this without comment and signaled the team to continue south. The exfil helicopter was 12 minutes late. They waited in a dried wash with rock walls that provided shade and concealment. During those 12 minutes, Dean Calloway moved to where the woman was sitting against the rock face, watching the open desert to the north with the handheld spotting scope. He sat down beside her. He looked at the desert. After a while, he said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," she said. "I was ready to push for a shot that Ryan couldn't confirm." "You were managing a clock," she said. "Under pressure, people seek resolution. It's not a character flaw. I would have taken the wrong shot." "Probably not," she said. "I think your shooter would have held." Dean was quiet. Then, "How long have you been operating in this region?" She thought about it. "On and off. 11 years. He looked at her. "You were in theater 11 years ago." She didn't answer that. "The briefing said additional asset," he said. "No name, no unit." She looked at the desert. "Those designations," she said, "tend to make things complicated." Marcus Webb was a signals specialist with a particular interest in patterns. He could not help what happened in the helicopter on the way back to the forward operating base. It was not intentional, he simply noticed things. He was looking at the encrypted traffic log from the pre-mission communications, the kind of automated record-keeping that happened regardless of classification level, and he noticed the origin point of the order that had sent the woman to their position. The origin was not a unit designation he recognized. The prefix was a number, not a word, a specific kind of number, with a specific formatting pattern that he had seen once before in a different context, in a different country, related to a program that had been officially discontinued several years prior. He did not say anything in the helicopter. He said something to Garrett when they were on the ground, in the small space between the landing pad and the debrief area. "The asset dispatch order," he said. "The origin prefix." "Don't," Garrett said. Marcus looked at him. "Write up what you observed in the field," Garrett said. "Write up the tactical outcome. That's what the debrief needs." "I understand that, but the prefix suggests." "I know what it suggests," Garrett said. "Then you know who she is." Garrett said nothing for a moment. He had been thinking about it since the helicopter. He had been going back through what he knew, and what he knew was fragmentary, secondhand, the kind of thing that circulated in the spaces between official records. The existence of a small group of individuals who had been attached to a multi-agency program in the early years of a particular conflict. The program's stated purpose was the development of non-standard targeting methodology in environments that defeated conventional systems. It had been defunded. Officially, what I know, Garrett said, is that without her, we don't complete this mission. The window closes, we extract with nothing. The target is still operational, right? That's what I know, Garrett said. The rest of it is above my clearance and yours. So we write up what we observed and we leave the prefix to the people whose job it is to deal with prefixes. Marcus was quiet. She knew what she was doing the moment she hit that ridgeline, Garrett said. She didn't learn it last year. Whatever that prefix means, it means she's been doing this long enough to have a file that the people who write files don't want cross-referenced. He paused. That's enough for me. They went to the debrief. The debrief took 3 hours. The woman was not present for it. By the time the team reached the forward operating base, she was already gone. The land cruiser was gone. The only physical evidence of her presence was a single line in the logbook at the gate checkpoint, an entry that recorded an asset arrival and departure, with no name, only a numerical designation that matched nothing in the base's current roster. Ryan Colby filed his own supplemental report. He was meticulous about this. He described the atmospheric conditions, the distortion event, the methodology she had used to identify the target through a refraction-corrected negative space, the absence of distortion as a positive indicator of physical presence. He described the shot in the technical language of a man who understood what he was documenting. At the bottom of the report, he added a section titled Observations on Technique. It was, by formal standards, outside the scope of what a supplemental was supposed to contain. He submitted it anyway. He wrote, "The shooter demonstrated a targeting methodology I have not previously encountered in operational practice or in formal training. The approach prioritizes environmental reading over optical resolution, identifying target presence through the analysis of ambient conditions rather than direct visual confirmation. This methodology would require significant time investment to develop to operational standard. I was unable to determine how long the shooter has been practicing it. Based on what I observed, I would estimate the answer is long enough that the methodology is no longer technique. It is instinct." He thought about that last sentence. He left it in. Garrett found her at the vehicle staging area, 20 minutes after the debrief ended. She was sitting on the front bumper of the Land Cruiser, drinking from a metal canteen. She looked at him as he approached and waited. "The debrief's done," he said. "I know." He stood for a moment. Then, "The team wants to know who trained you." She considered this. Why? Because Ryan Colby has been shooting since he was 15. He's qualified on more platforms than most people know exist. He has never seen anyone do what you did today. Garrett paused. He wants to know where that comes from. She looked at him. "What does that information accomplish?" "It doesn't accomplish anything," Garrett said. "It's just a question." She looked down at the canteen. She turned it in her hands. The metal was scratched around the rim in a specific pattern, the kind of damage you got from years of being clipped to a harness, not from being dropped. "My father was a surveyor," she said. Garrett waited. "Land surveyor. He worked in terrain like this. Before I ever touched a rifle, I spent summers in the field with him learning how to read ground, how to identify where water had been, where soil composition changed, how thermal activity affected the accuracy of optical measurements." She paused. "He used to say, the instrument tells you what it sees. It doesn't tell you what's there. Those are different things. You have to know the difference." Garrett said. "And the shooting?" "The shooting came later," she said. "The seeing came first." He thought about that for a moment. "The team's young soldier," he said. "Fielding. The one on his first rotation. He was going to ask you something before you left." "I know," she said. "He already did." Garrett looked at her. "When?" "He was waiting by the vehicle when I came down from the debrief." She put the cap back on the canteen. "He asked how I saw the target." "What did you tell him?" She stood up from the bumper. She picked up her bag from the ground beside the vehicle and settled it on her shoulder. "I told him I didn't find the target," she said. "I found the place where everything was wrong. The target was where the wrongness was." Garrett looked at her. He thought about the 4 hours on the ridgeline. The 3 failed assessments. Ryan's absolute technical competence, applied to a problem that technology could not solve. He thought about the moment she had turned from her scope and said, "You're not seeing the target, you're seeing where the target appears to be." They're different things. He had been in the field for 16 years. He had not thought to separate those two. That's the whole thing, isn't it? He said. It was not quite a question. That's the whole thing, she said. She opened the driver's door of the Land Cruiser. Colonel Harmon will get a report, she said. It will have what he needs. And what about us? She looked at him. Her expression was, for the first time since she had arrived at the ridgeline, something that was not quite neutral, not warm, not soft, but fractionally less closed. The way a difficult door opens by a degree before stopping. You completed the mission, she said. You kept your team intact. You made a good call when the information required a different response than the one you trained for. She paused. That's not nothing. She got in. Started the engine. The sound of it was comfortable and unhurried. Garrett stepped back. The Land Cruiser moved out of the staging area and onto the track that led south. He watched it until the dust it raised had settled and the flat horizon had taken it back. Behind him, he heard Dean Calloway's voice. Is she gone? She's gone, Garrett said. A pause. Then Fielding, young Fielding, 22 years old, on his first rotation, who had stood on that ridgeline and watched something happen that he did not yet have the vocabulary to describe, said, "What's her name?" Garrett thought about Marcus Webb's prefix, about the routing number on the dispatch order, about the file that was almost certainly somewhere in a system that neither he nor anyone on his team was cleared to access. He thought about the way she had moved up the ridgeline as though she had climbed it before, and about the spotting scope with the worn housing, and about the sentence she had spoken that had reoriented the entire tactical picture in 15 words. I don't know her name, Garrett said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ryan said, with the careful precision of a man selecting the right word for the right measurement, it doesn't matter. They walked back toward the operations building. The desert held its heat. The sun moved west. The mission was complete. Somewhere south, on a track that didn't appear on standard maps, a woman in a sand-colored shirt drove with the windows down. On the seat beside her, the old rifle in its bag, the canteen in the cup holder. She was not thinking about the shot. She was thinking about the layer of cold air at 600 meters, the way it had been thinner in the morning and thicker by noon, the specific quality of the light when the refraction was at its peak. She was thinking about what her father had said about optical measurement in high-heat terrain 32 years ago, in a different desert, on a different continent, when she was 8 years old and carrying the end of his survey tape through rock that burned the soles of her boots. The instrument tells you what it sees, not what's there. She turned south. The track went on,